Hey, Presales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Scott Blacker, Global Head of Solutions Engineering at Atlassian. The topic of today's episode is leveraging the flywheel at scale. You've heard it many times. Atlassian went to market without any salespeople. Is that fact or is that fiction? Well, today in the episode, Scott's actually going to discuss what the Atlassian go-to-market motion is. How does it affect solutions engineers? And what does this motion look like as Atlassian goes into the enterprise space? And so today's episode, we're going to really dive into what has made Atlassian successful, what that go-to-market motion looks like, how it affects pre-sales organizations, and how pre-sales is the tip of the spear in this motion and as it relates to innovation within their organization. This is a really interesting conversation and one that I will mention that we are continuing at the Pre-Sales Leadership Symposium on June 7th, 2022. Enjoy today's episode.
Pre-sales activities are scattered across tools, consuming a lot of work time and creative energy. Meet Prescale, an all-in-one pre-sales intelligence platform that helps you to streamline evaluation experiences, deliver impactful solutions, and improve technical conversions. With a unified workspace, Prescale enables teams to identify and engage with best-fit prospects, document niche product interactions, and accelerate product conviction to drive sales conversions. Learn more at prescale.com.
Hey, Scott, welcome to the Presales Podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks, James. Appreciate it.
I'm glad to have you on the podcast. So you are a PSLC member, and we actually met in person at the DC local event at the end of 2021. And I thought it was great to finally meet you in person. I feel like we've talked probably half a dozen times through PSLC events, and it was just great to finally have that face-to-face interaction.
It was great to see you there too. And it was actually great to see other humans there because that was one of the first things I actually got out of the house for that was industry and work related. And so it was really good to actually meet people. So thank you for putting that on.
Absolutely. And one of the things about DC is there are a lot of pre-sales professionals and a lot of pre-sales leaders in DC. So I was happy that we were able to have that event, and we'll definitely be doing that again. But Scott, talking about you and your engagement and involvement in the Presales Collective, you're actually going to be the keynote at our Presales Leadership Collective Symposium on June 7th. And we're going to be talking a little bit about this. Are you ready for the topic?
Let's do it.
All right. Before we get into it, Scott, talk to us about your career journey.
So mine is a little non-traditional from a pre-sales perspective. I have actually spent the majority of my career in product management, starting right when I graduated all the way through about 3 years ago. And my specific story, I helped start a company about 7 years ago that was acquired by Atlassian. And at that company, I was AgileCraft, now is Jira Align, one of the product lines within Atlassian. I was responsible for product. But I found myself over the arc of the company, from the day we started to the day we got acquired, just super drawn into the field. And so I wound up involved in almost every transaction that we did in some way, shape, or form. And I remember talking to somebody at this point about what's your favorite part about your job? And my answer, which I didn't realize at the time, but it was a pre-sales answer, was I love like the moment I'm at the whiteboard. And so it's not the demo, it's I'm with a customer. It is a really complex problem. We're trying to figure out how they work together. We've got all these markers out and all these squiggles and boxes going in every which direction to try and figure out what it is they're trying to accomplish and to start to imagine what that solution would look like. And it was just like, it's this like rush of creative energy. And I look back, and I really didn't connect those dots until frankly, I was thinking about this particular podcast and like how I got here. I was like, yeah, that was it. Like, that's the essence of like the strategic value that pre-sales brings to the table. And so when we joined Atlassian, they were looking for somebody to start effectively the pre-sales function. There were 10 SEs at that time, but they were in different pockets of the org supporting different products. And although I wasn't specifically a pre-sales engineer, the thesis was, let's do something a little bit different. And so I had a little bit of that enterprise DNA from like, how do you like actually go out and talk to customers, and a little bit of that, hey, I'm not trying to rebuild what all the competitors do because I actually don't know. So let's figure this out in a very uniquely Atlassian way. And that's how I got here.
I love hearing your background and your story. And I do think you as a product person and doing a lot of those pre-sales activities have obviously prepared you for this role. Today's topic is leveraging the flywheel at scale. And I'm really excited to talk about this with you, Scott, because I feel like so many people hear about what Atlassian has done. And in this episode, we want to actually break it down. I've heard rumors, Atlassian got to, billions of dollars of revenue without one salesperson, right? And is that true? We'll get into that. But I think what you're doing at Atlassian is really cutting edge. And I think one of the things that I've learned about my purview at the Presales Collective now is I'm talking to dozens and dozens of companies and leaders of these companies, and they're all trying to figure out, how do we build our pre-sales organization to map to the customer journey and the buying journey right now? I mean, the acceleration that's happened over COVID has, I think, changed sales and buying. And so these pre-sales organizations want to figure out how best to meet their prospect where they are. And I think a lot of what Atlassian has been doing for years is ahead of that trend. Let's maybe start with that first question. A lot has been said that Atlassian built a giant company without sales and pre-sales people. Is that true? And can you share a little bit of the Atlassian success story for us?
So yes and no. There are salespeople. They aren't necessarily called salespeople. I think if you look at the journey of Atlassian, and Mike and Scott, the founders, and Jay and Cameron, the president, now Cameron, our current CEO, will tell this story often, which is that the company was built on the foundation of product-led growth, even though that wasn't necessarily a known thing at the time. I think there's a lot of innovation in that model, particularly as the company scaled. At a certain point, it can't be zero, right? People are swiping credit cards and buying things. And at some point, somebody has a question or somebody needs help with a billing, issue. And so the first incarnation of that, some 10, 15, whatever years ago, was more around what we would call product advocates or customer advocates. And these are people that would answer a question for you about the product if you had one and you called. They're not trying to sell you anything. They're not managing the account, but they're facilitating the buying process. And so that's more like help you buy versus sell to you. And I think that's an important distinction. And then over time, the most senior of those folks started to become what we will call enterprise advocates. And that would be more of a traditional salesperson. And the most senior of those product advocates, the people that could actually explain what the product did, became solutions engineers. And so let's talk 3 years ago when I really joined and had a good purview of this. We were about $1 billion company. There were 10, 30 salespeople. There were 10-ish or so sales engineers, right? But we were $1 billion company, and our peer companies had 20 times that number of folks. And now we're about 50 or 60 SEs, right? The company is a $2.5 billion company. And so the growth of the enterprise motion that augments what the Flywheel does, and we can kind of get into this later, is outpacing the overall growth of the company. Why? Because what the Flywheel does is attracts new customers, gets them from a credit card swipe to $100,000 a year, but it doesn't really get them from $100,000 to $2 million. And so nobody's swiping a credit card for $5 million, right? There is a different motion that comes into play when you're looking at these enterprise relationships. And so that's really where we come in. And we can go into that a little bit more later when we talk about the role of pre-sales at Atlassian.
Some of the debate that I've had and seen around the community is that no one's using a credit card for a $2 million transaction. And I think that's why you have some of the pushback on the PLG motion. But when Todd Olson, CEO and founder of Pendo.io, joined us at the symposium last year, he talked about how all those small PLG motions are really just small fires that turn into a larger fire in terms of how you encapsulate the enterprise motion, right? You have all these small PLG motions that are happening to sit on top of a larger enterprise deal. Let's talk about the go-to-market motion and go-to-market strategy for Atlassian. What does that look like to you?
First of all, there's two big ways to think about the go-to-market motion: the flywheel, right? And then the enterprise, the augmentation of that flywheel. To Todd's point about kind of aggregating those small little fires into a large account and then putting a stronger wrapper around that. We have 250,000 customers. Less than 5% we would actually put this high touch motion to. You got to think about it. It's not a this or this. It really is this natural progression of what these accounts look like. And when you talk about Atlassian as a product-led growth company, that is true from a growth perspective, 100%. But it's also very true at that 95% level, right? And then where we get involved is the tip of the spear. When you talk about the overall motion of Atlassian, the big picture thing to think about are key competitors in the space that are large public companies. When you look at their financials, 30% sales and marketing, 15% R&D from an investment perspective. At Atlassian, that's inverted. 30% R&D, 15% go-to-market. So for every dollar they're spending on building new software and innovating, we're spending $2, which means that the pace at which we can innovate over time is a dramatically different trajectory than our competitors. But what that also means is we have a lot fewer people to show up and take your CIO to lunch and kind of engage in that motion. And so that is part of the secret sauce of the go-to-market motion. But the path to $5 and $10 billion does go through those enterprise relationships. And so our need to invest in that area to augment the flywheel with this enterprise motion is really where we come in.
That's super interesting. And I have a lot of questions, Scott, but let's talk about the flywheel. You've mentioned it a couple times. What is the flywheel effect?
So the flywheel is the essence of a product-led growth company, which is that through great discovery that folks will start to use and find your product, and you make it easy to buy, right? And easy to get, and remove all the friction from the process in terms of buying and whatnot. Make it easy to get into somebody's hands. And then make for a super compelling experience so that person one talks to person two, talks to person three. And without having to go in and invest in driving that growth, it's a natural evolution of what the product does itself. The product itself drives the growth. As a team-based product, Atlassian is particularly good at this because it's not actually super useful to use Jira if you're just using it by yourself. You have a team. That team works together. Our ticker symbol is team. But then you go from one team to two to three, and that starts to expand across the enterprise. And so the flywheel is that natural motion where, now not only have we expanded that account, but one of those developers goes to, another company and they start using Jira, and we didn't have to go sell to them because they loved it so much that they brought it to bear in another organization. And so that flywheel just spins. It starts to spin itself, just like a flywheel in physics. And our job as an enterprise sales team is to pick off the organizations that hit a certain threshold in that flywheel and start to sell to them. So we I think we never would go to knock on somebody's door. Hi, we're Atlassian. We know you don't use us today. Let me tell you about our software. It's all picking companies off of the flywheel that have the potential to go from that, 6-figure to 7-figure opportunity.
This is where I really want to get into the crux of the episode, because I think this is so fascinating. I just heard you say that there's not really an outbound effort, an outbound energy, which is probably the inverse of most startups and scale-ups out there. So you talked about this flywheel motion and picking people off, and 95% of your customers kind of being in this repeatable phase. But you've decided to start picking people off. But where is the tipping point of when you need to start bringing in these enterprise sellers or more of a traditional motion? Where is that at?
So first, it's fluid, and that dollar amount will change depending on the investment envelope of the organization. And so we can decide as an organization, are we going to try and mine the top 1% or 2% or 3% of it? And that really is just about turning that dial, because the more you invest, then the larger that envelope is. The more that 15% of sales and marketing spend goes to 16, goes to 17. And so we're very cautious about that. What I will say, the segmentation from the product-led type growth companies, so we call those bronze accounts. The flywheel is doing its thing. Our channel partners are doing their thing and augmenting them. At some point through our segmentation and math, right, we'll say, okay, that customer becomes one that we think we should invest in more, either because they hit a certain spending threshold or because they hit our radar from an account penetration potential. And that's when they would get classified in a different segment. And that's when they would get a salesperson and a SE and a whole team kind of associated with that particular account.
So Scott, I am curious from a product perspective. I assume that you guys are using a lot of data behind the scenes, if you're allowed to share this, on how and when a company is ready for that separate motion. Is that a fair assumption?
Totally fair. So I'll stay away from the specific dollar thresholds or the specific what that looks like. And I think that'll be different for every company. I mean, there's obviously an investment window or investment envelope that organizations make from an overall go-to-market perspective. And each company decides what at what ASP, right? Does it make sense to invest in an expensive selling motion and at what level? And for some companies, that's $50,000 for an inside sales, $100,000 for a big ticket enterprise sale. It might be $150K. It really depends on how you're built and what you're doing and what your income statement is supposed to look like.
Let's talk about the pre-sales team, because I want to really dive into this. Talk to me about the impact of the pre-sales organization, maybe especially as it was when you were $1 billion and 10 SEs. What was it actually on a day-to-day basis?
Back in the day, right, it would have been more of a queue. Pre-sales, with a lot of sales folks out there, an individual rep needs help. They either put a request into a queue or they reach out to somebody for some technical help or some technical explanation. And this is for product-led growth organizations that are looking to overlay an enterprise motion into that to augment the flywheel. That's how it starts. So you start small. You're not going to start off with 100 salespeople with this pairing ratio and whatnot. You're just going to kind of pick off the top 1, 2, 3. When that becomes 50, when that becomes 100, then you have to start doing something a little bit different. And so what we saw the model evolve to over the past few years as we've grown as an organization is this more queue-based technical, let me answer questions for you motion, to a very solution-based, I would say more traditional, yet it's a traditional overlay on the flywheel motion. So our SEs pair with their sales counterparts. We pair based on a given ratio, right? That ratio depends on what they're selling and what the motion is and what that looks like. A lot of what we do internally at Atlassian is the upsell of existing customers onto new products. We'll call that cross-sell, or the expansion of those accounts, right? Or the transition of those accounts from, and this is kind of where we are in our journey right now, from a traditional behind the firewall motion to a cloud-based product. And so we do a lot of technical conversations that really explain what our application architecture looks like in the cloud. We do a lot of what we call cloud differentiated value conversations, talking about the benefit of our product in the cloud versus behind the firewall. And then we have a couple of motions around like Jira Align or our ITSM motion, where we really have it's net new products for these organizations. And the responsibility of the sales rep is to cross-sell those products into the accounts. And so we have some SEs that are core that support the overall account motion, right? And then we have some SEs that are specialists in those domains that would come in to support the cross-sell, particularly when the domain like Agile at Scale or IT service management is a whole market within itself that requires a lot of specialized knowledge.
If you don't mind me asking, in terms of the hiring profile that you're looking for, are most of your SEs more technical in nature?
There's two flavors, and I'm glad you asked. We're hiring lots of SEs over the next year, and it cuts both ways. So there is a need for a deeply technical kind of SE function, particularly when it comes to talking about the safety of the cloud and our application architecture and security and compliance. But more and more so, it's a solution motion. And so in those domains, IT service management, we've got folks that are experts in incident management, change management, request management. They are technical, but they're super solution and value oriented from a focus perspective. And when you look at the arc of Atlassian and how our products come together, software teams, IT teams, business teams, they're needing to explain how collaboration needs to happen across all those organizations, that becomes the Atlassian story. And so we're really focused right now on, hey, you might have swiped your credit card because you were interested in a developer using us for Agile. But the reason why your CIO is going to put a $2 million ELA in place is because Atlassian is going to provide end-to-end collaboration between your business and technology teams for the whole of organization. And you're going to use the right tool for the right spot. And the SE's got to own that message from a holistic perspective.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Scott, because that's kind of where I wanted to go next. What is that experience like for the customer? They're used to just swiping their credit card, doing their own thing, and then all of a sudden they're getting, a message from the Atlassian sales and pre-sales team. How does that dynamic change, and how important is the pre-sales professional to changing that relationship?
So I'm going to give a super weird answer here, because the number one thing I hear, and I've been in probably a dozen of these calls, is thank God, finally somebody to talk to. So it's not like, now I got to talk to some salesperson that showed up. It's like I've been looking for somebody at Atlassian. Now we do have a whole customer success organization that's emergent, and the top 1% of our customers might have a technical account manager who they can talk to. But the vast majority, even of those enterprise customers, they can't find somebody at Atlassian. And so it's very frustrating, right? I'm trying to give you money. Just come talk to me and explain to me how this is going to work. It really is. They're thirsty for that relationship. They want the relationship with the vendor. And I think because we were so shy in this area and not investing, it kind of created that dynamic where we're getting pulled into these relationships. We are definitely not having to break down doors or do that more traditional cold calling.
I think it's a good position to be in, right? Most people would be wishing that they had that type of situation. But what was the change management like with your team? You had 10 people. You obviously are 3 or 4 times that on, maybe 2-time revenue. What was that evolution internally like to get people to say, hey, like, this is what we've done. This is what we've done so well, but this is where we need to go. Did you face a lot of pushback, or was it like, hey, this is about time to do this?
So the DNA of the company is very product driven. There's really nobody that's saying we don't want to do this. I mean, there's a lot of investment and energy. And it is a great time to be in pre-sales at Atlassian, right? And in the enterprise selling motion as always. There's investment, there's growth, it's fun, it's innovative. Like, we're doing different things. You're at the tip of the spear in terms of where the industry is headed, right? From this merging of enterprise and product-led growth. So it's fantastic. Now, the DNA of the company, right? The DNA of product and marketing is very product oriented, not so much solution and stories. So they're all tuned to look at the data of what 1,000 customers are doing to drive more effective product-led growth, or to tell a story on the website for a developer to swipe that credit card. It's not tuned to the CIO, right, who's looking to make these larger, more strategic enterprise decisions. That's one of the unique things about Atlassian's SE team, which is that we're not just responsible for transactions, right? We are responsible for innovation. And so we carve out a significant portion of our overall team's capacity to innovate, right? To create the new solution motions, to put the new demo scripts in place, to provide feedback loops into product management. And that carve out right, is something that it shouldn't really exist within pre-sales, right? This function should exist within product marketing and product, and it will one day. But until it does, our goal is to fill that gap, do it as smart and strategically as we can, and always provide that feedback into product and marketing so that we can become more enterprise focused in that portion of our go-to-market motion, and that paves the way for us. And I'll say just a shout out because it's the team. We hire super well. We look for people that are looking to be innovative, that really want to roll up their sleeves, yet at the same time are very dollar and sales focused and kind of want to win. And when you find the right folks that fit into the culture, we have extraordinarily low turnover on the SE team here. And that's, I think part and parcel of the management team we put in place. And so a shout out to the team that's come along the way. It's been a phenomenal experience.
That's great, Scott. And I love hearing that the pre-sales team is the pillar and really the focal point of innovation. That's what some of the best sales organizations look like, is when they've created space for their creative technical pre-sales team to go and figure out how do we expand the boundaries of what we're doing for our customers. That's getting to that light bulb moment and making it part of the DNA is, I think, a lot easier said than done. Scott, as we talk about your organization, one of the things that we've lightly talked about offline is the shift that you're going through and the future of your organization, the future of your sales and pre-sales team. So with everything that we've talked about, where are you going in terms of taking this PLG motion and putting an enterprise motion on top of it or alongside it for the future of your team's growth?
So I think that there's three things here. I think we'll continue to be the tip of the spear as it relates to innovation within Atlassian, because that's a never-ending, always moving kind of line. And I think it's part and parcel of the culture of the team that we're building. And I think it fits really well within kind of Atlassian's innovation framework. And so I see us continuing to invest in innovation and to drive that forward. Secondly, and we didn't really talk about this, the channel is a really big part of what we do. And so it oversimplifies it a little bit to talk about the 95% flywheel and the 5% enterprise, because there's this whole muscle out there that's driving a significant portion of Atlassian's revenue. And that is the ecosystem of marketplace partners that sell software in our marketplace and the ecosystem of solution partners that are implementing Atlassian software and selling it on our behalf. And so that's the secret sales force, if you will, the channel partners who are taking some margin and then making the bulk of their dollars off of services. The history of those channel partners is that, I was a Jira admin at so-and-so, and I hung up a shingle because, I saw an opportunity here. And that's some of them, and some of them are huge, and some of them are now the GSIs. The need for the solution engineering team to not only drive sales of companies we're directly talking to, but to enable channel partners to sell these new things on our behalf is strong. And so one area of investment for us as we go into the next arc is how do we better enable those solution partners so that I don't have to hire 3 more SEs, we can hire 1 more SE, but that has the effect of making 10 more SEs within the channel. And so that's something that wasn't a huge component of what we did 5 years ago because the channel was very self-enabled. The Jira admin already knew what they were doing when they hung up the shingle. But with new cross-sell, right, new upsell type opportunities, that's not a native muscle. So we've got to do that. And then third is, I think, just the natural growth and evolution of, what does a specific account look like? And, the envelope of 50 accounts for a salesperson and what an SE does is very different than if I have 15 accounts, is very different than if I have 3 accounts. And so thinking through what those engagement models look like as we get more vested in individual accounts, whatever that looks like over time, is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about.
So Scott, this has been a really interesting conversation in terms of how Atlassian has gone to market and where you're going. As this relates to the pre-sales profession and the Presales Collective, going back to my initial comments, this is why we want to bring you to the Leadership Symposium to talk about what you're doing. I'm curious on how you see this model will work in traditional enterprise companies or companies that are leading with a PLG motion. What does this model look like 5 to 10 years from now to other companies?
First, it's a tough model for existing traditional enterprise companies to try and reverse engineer a flywheel, particularly from an SE perspective, right? You've got a traditional model, you've got SEs kind of overlaid in there. You can get more efficient. There's plenty of things you can do to become an awesome enterprise sales company, but it's not like merging that product-led growth motion, because then you're just trying to become more and more efficient. And the DNA of the company is kind of towards heavier set motion, and that can be tough. From a product-led growth perspective, I think the first thing is it's not for everybody. So if you're out there building a company, wherever stage you're in, you've got to determine if that's the right model for you. And if it is, just focus on that. Before you can pick companies off the flywheel, you got to build a flywheel. I think I would encourage folks to focus there. Whatever ASP you need to be at, to consider a company in that enterprise segment to pick it off and appropriately invest in enterprise selling motion. And again, only you can determine that based on where your investment thesis and what you're trying to do as an organization. As that model proves out, companies need to cross the chasm. And that's where the product-led growth augmentation of an SE function can come in. And so my advice is start small. You can start with these, what we used to have called product advocates, right? So SE style people that come in to facilitate buying and to facilitate question answering versus going out there and hunting, if you will. And then as that gets bigger, that's when you can start to layer on. You slowly grow those teams, you slowly advance it. You do it at pace, sales and SE together, what we would call these customer advocates and product advocates together. And eventually that model and that muscle grows. As you look at the size of organization that's coming in, as you look at the size of deal cycle and customer lifetime value that you think you can achieve, and what investment you want to make in the overall selling motion, right? All those folks coming together. If as an SE leader, and you're coming into a company that's a traditional Flywheel company, and you're thinking, how do I augment this with an enterprise model versus, how do I change the company? So think augment, not disrupt the Flywheel. I think that's great news for valuations because companies are looking for credible paths over key revenue bumps. And that path to those larger contract values, right, really is that intersection. And so I think it's a great time to be in this kind of space.
I love that. So I think my last question was going to be advice to leaders out there who want to alter their go-to-market strategy to support this buying motion. Do you have anything else to add there?
I think in line with what I just said. So one, start small. Right, you don't need to go hire like a big team. You can start to experiment and see what's working and what's not, and start with the first salesperson and the first SE, or start with like very technically oriented salespeople that can handle a portion of the SE load. That sort of hybrid model is a good place to start. Eventually, you need multi-dimensional type of folks that can handle different components and specialization, but you don't need that from day one. And then second, culture is key, right? So if you decide you're going to bring in the martini drinking sales exec as your first person to augment the Flywheel, and you've got the SE that, likes to have the nice dinners when you go visit customers every week, that's not going to work. The culture is key. And so you've got to find people that are innovative, that want to roll up their sleeves, that are willing to get into the lane of the organization, but have a vision for where this is going to go. Then you can grow with the organization versus fight the organization. And that's better for everybody. And it's going to be a much better outcome.
Very good point, Scott. I really appreciate that. And Channing Farrer, who was over at HubSpot, has since moved to Built-In, wrote an article on the Presales Collective blog about that model, starting small, starting in a transactional business, building those wins, and then being able to take that motion upstream or upmarket within the rest of the organization. So Scott, this has been a fascinating conversation. I feel like I have hours of questions for you if you only gave me the time, but we will continue this on June 7th at the Presales Leadership Symposium. So I appreciate you being the keynote and talking about this a little bit more for our pre-sales community. And thanks for joining me today on the podcast.
Thanks so much, James. Take care.
All right, Presales Collective. I don't know about you, but I have so many thoughts right now. My head is spinning. One of the reasons why I wanted to bring Scott onto the podcast is we just continue to hear about Atlassian. But more importantly, they were one of the first companies with this product-led growth motion before it even was called product-led growth. And they built a massive organization, but are now building that pre-sales function and introducing more of an enterprise motion. And that is the inverse of most companies that we know today. We're also starting to see larger, more mature companies trying to embrace a PLG motion. As Scott said, it's a little bit hard to work backwards, but I think that I've heard some successes with some companies out there in terms of how they're approaching this PLG light motion with pre-sales as the tip of the spear. And I don't want to get too far into it, but some of the conversations I've been having with other founders, other VCs, people out there is that they think that the pre-sales profession could really split into two ways. You have this PLG motion where pre-sales is the first touch point with a customer. And then you have your traditional enterprise motion, which is the BDR, AE, SE team selling combo. And I think that that is a fascinating conversation that we want to continue to have around the Presales Collective, because as we think about pre-sales getting a strategic seat at the executive table, these are the type of organizational structures that allow the pre-sales teams and the solutions engineering team to have a heavier role in the success of a customer and to closing business. So it's a fascinating conversation that we want to continue to have around the Presales Collective and around the Leadership Collective. If you're a leader and you're part of Presales Leadership Collective, we hope to see you on June 7th. If you are a leader and you're not in part of Presales Leadership Collective yet, please go to presalescollective.com/lead and learn a little bit more about Presales Leadership Collective. And if you're listening and you think something from this conversation has made sense to you or really stood out and you want to continue the conversation, please reach out to me on Slack. I say this all the time. Just message me on Slack. Would love to discuss this because we want to put out more content related to this subject. All right, Presales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, please do like and share the podcast. Give us that review. It really helps us in terms of expanding our audience. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.